Imagine you've just woken up in the year 1347. It's foggy, someone smells like sheep stew, and the entire town is buzzing because it's execution day. You didn't win a ticket. There were no tickets. You're just expected to show up. Why? Because witnessing public death was basically medieval Netflix, except bloodier and mandatory. Welcome to the twisted, screamingly awkward, half-terrified, half-thrilled life of a medieval execution witness, where torture was entertainment, and your permanent trauma was just part of the vibe. Still here? Great. Grab your favorite medieval-themed pillow, hit that subscribe button, and prepare to emotionally unravel, gently, one beheading at a time. You wake up with a mouthful of hay, and last night's turnip stew still doing laps in your stomach. It's cold. Not charming medieval crisp morning cold. More like your toes are negotiating a mutiny cold. And the smell, a fine blend of damp wool, pig, and a generous helping of anxiety. But there's no time for complaining. Not unless you want to miss today's big social event, because it's execution day. The church bell tolls, low, slow, and judgmental, like it knows what you did last summer, or last night. Doesn't matter. The noise crawls through the village like a gossiping widow. The air thickens with expectation. Doors creak open. Cloaks are thrown on. Someone somewhere lights a pipe. And just like that, your village transforms from sleepy mud puddle into a buzzing amphitheater of dread. Congratulations. You're going to a murder. And not just any murder. A state-sponsored, heavily attended, possibly botched one. You didn't buy a ticket. There are no seats. There is, however, an invisible pressure to show up, because not witnessing someone's public dismemberment is basically medieval jury duty evasion. You don't want to be that guy, the one who skipped the hanging. People talk, so you drag yourself toward the square, a low stone clearing between the church, the tavern, and the scaffold, which is basically a raised wooden stage, built specifically for human expiration. Think of it like a very grim theatre production, except the lead actor dies for real, and there's a noticeable lack of jazz hands. The crowd is already gathering. Mud-caked boots, ratty shawls, children standing on overturned baskets for a better view. Old men sharpen opinions. Women sell ale in cracked clay mugs. Someone is definitely pickpocketing. It's practically festive. You elbow your way into the pack, close enough to smell the executioner's leather gloves, not close enough to get blood on your tunic. The sweet spot. If you were lucky, you brought a stool. If you were really lucky, you've already started pre-drinking. And then there it is, the scaffold. Just wood and rope. But it might as well be a colosseum. Everyone's eyes are drawn to it like moths to an open wound. The noose dangles lazily in the morning wind. A few birds argue on the crossbeam, utterly unfazed by the forthcoming horror show. A question settles on the crowd like frost. Who's it gonna be? Sometimes you know. Word spreads quickly in towns where literally nothing else happens. But sometimes the authorities keep it hush-hush, just to spice things up, because who doesn't love a surprise hanging? Let that sink in for a moment. You, a peasant who bathes twice a year and considers bread a complete food group, are about to spend your morning watching a man die, and not just die, be executed, in full view, as public policy, and you'll stand there, stomach rumbling, probably judging his haircut. And here's the kicker. You still think you're morally superior because he stole a goat, or insulted a bishop, or, God forbid, muttered something in French. Meanwhile, you once sneezed during Mass, and nobody batted an eye. Clearly you're spiritually bulletproof. Behind you someone coughs. Another man mutters a prayer under his breath, as if divine intervention is more likely to show up than the baker who still owes you rye. The atmosphere thickens, the kind of hush that says something awful is about to happen, and we're all emotionally underqualified. Then, a shuffle. A sound from behind the church. Heads turn. The crowd leans forward as if they're watching a royal procession. Not the human equivalent of a trash cart being wheeled out for disposal. Two guards appear, flanking someone in chains. The condemned. He's not screaming. That comes later, maybe. Right now, he's shuffling like a man who just stepped barefoot into his own funeral. Because he has. Every face in the crowd locks onto his like barn owls on a wounded mouse. You don't know his name. You don't really care. But for the next 15 minutes, his death is your entertainment. Your lesson. Your morality play. Your early morning brunch viewing. What a way to start the day. You shift from foot to foot. Your ankles are numb. A child asks what's happening, and his mother hushes him in that brittle tone that means watch and learn. Someone spits. The guards mount the scaffold steps, hauling the condemned like a broken marionette. He looks younger than you expected, maybe even younger than you. His lip is split. One eye is swollen shut. A priest trails behind him like an afterthought, with a Bible and the world's worst job description. The executioner is already waiting. Cloaked, hooded, unsmiling. Because of course he's hooded. Even a medieval death technician has branding standards. His hands are big. You've heard rumors. He killed a man once just by slapping him. Probably untrue. Still unsettling, the priest murmurs last rites. The crowd pretends to listen. Really, they're just measuring the wind, wondering if it'll be a clean drop, or if the condemned will dangle like a cursed wind chime, while his lungs fold in on themselves. And this is the part where you wonder, am I a good person? You who just laughed when someone in the back made a gallows joke. You who almost brought snacks. You who knows this is horrible, and showed up anyway. Then again, if you didn't come, would you be next? The crowd holds its collective breath. Even the pigeons go still. The executioner steps forward, rope in hand. The condemned opens his mouth, maybe to say something profound, maybe just to spit blood, but we'll pause here, because this is just the beginning. The warm-up act. The curtain rise on a centuries-long drama of pain, power, punishment, and really questionable audience etiquette. And lucky you, you're in the front row. Let's be honest, you didn't come just because it was mandatory. Sure, the town crier said something vague about justice and moral order, but deep down you came for the same reason everyone else did, the spectacle. Because executions weren't just punishments in medieval Europe. They were public service announcements wrapped in horror shows, garnished with prayer, and served on a bed of political seasoning. Basically, if Game of Thrones and a religious revival had a very unstable baby, you'd name it Execution Day. There were no concerts, no movies, no bake-off. Your entertainment options boiled down to getting mildly intoxicated in a freezing tavern, watching two pigs fight over an onion, or witnessing a human life end in spectacular, screaming fashion. Guess which one packed the biggest crowd? And this wasn't a once-a-decade thing. In cities like London or Paris, executions were regular calendar fixtures. People literally planned around them. Merchants brought extra wares. Nobles made appearances. Kids skipped school, though calling it school was generous when most education consisted of memorizing which saints died the goriest deaths. So yes, everyone showed up. From the local farmer with hay in his beard, to the slightly drunk blacksmith's wife who always laughs too loud. And they didn't just attend quietly. They cheered, applauded, sometimes even threw things. This wasn't just a civic duty. It was a vibe. It might sound psychotic now, but think about the cultural logic at play. Executions were moral theatre. A live-action sermon about what happened if you coloured outside the societal lines. You steal a loaf of bread, you swing, you question the bishop, you burn, you skip work on St. Mercurius's feast day. Look, best to keep your affairs in order. Every execution sent a message. Loud, bloody, and unmissable. This wasn't about correcting behaviour. It was about displaying power. It was about reminding you, the humble peasant, that you are not the main character in this story. You're a spectator. The moment you forget that, well, you might end up center stage. But let's be generous to your medieval self for a moment. Maybe you genuinely believed that public death could purify the community, that watching a bad person die might cleanse the air like some spiritual Febreze. Maybe cheering wasn't just cruelty. Maybe it was relief. Thank God it's him, not me. Still, we can't pretend there wasn't a solid helping of good old-fashioned bloodlust. Let's talk about the guy next to you. Let's call him Bernard. Bernard came early. He brought his children. He also brought sausages, and not for sharing. Bernard is the kind of man who lives for executions. He ranks them. He critiques the rope work. He has a favourite hangman, for heaven's sake. And here's the real twist. Bernard is not an outlier. He's the average audience member, because the authorities wanted Bernard to cheer. They encouraged it. A silent, indifferent crowd. That's a nervous city, but a loud, emotionally invested mob. That's a compliant population. You're not just watching justice, you're participating in it. The cheering becomes a ritual, a kind of exorcism. If the condemned screams, you cheer louder. If he repents, you boo. If he dies badly, you shout, shame, like you're personally offended by the lack of entertainment value. Sound familiar? Yeah, it should. Today we call it the comment section. Still, let's not oversimplify. Not everyone cheered. Some cried, some prayed, some quietly turned away and whispered to themselves that they'd never get used to this. But those people were drowned out, because the execution wasn't designed to allow quiet reflection. It was designed to shock, impress, and overwhelm. Take, for example, the use of trumpets. Not for musical flair, but to literally drown out the condemned's last words, just in case they said something awkward like, "I didn't do it," or "the king's a fraud." Can't have that. Better to blast a horn in everyone's face and keep the mood on track, or look at the grandstands. In larger cities, they built raised viewing platforms for wealthy spectators. You could pay for a better view of someone dying. That's not punishment. That's business. It's community theatre with a side of gallows. Sometimes they even dress the condemned for the occasion. Clean robes, shaved heads, maybe a dramatic sign hung around the neck, like a tragic actor hitting his mark, because this was still a performance. And every performance needs costuming. And speaking of performance, let's not forget the hangman's monologue. In many cases, the executioner would address the crowd, maybe declare the sentence, maybe warn the children, or maybe, if he was feeling spicy, remind everyone to behave, lest they be next. And again, the crowd would nod, clap, cheer. So now we circle back to the question, why did everyone show up and cheer? Because it was expected. Because it was entertaining. Because it was scary. And because nothing made you feel more obedient than watching someone else get punished. And if that all feels a little uncomfortable, good. Because deep down, the execution wasn't about the guy on the scaffold. It was about you, your fear, your loyalty, your place in the order of things. The message was simple: watch, obey, survive. And so you watched, even if your hands shook, even if you hated it, even if you secretly hoped it rained before the rope snapped. Because in a world with no lawyers, no appeals, and no sympathy, the crowd was the courtroom, and your presence, that was your alibi. Now, take a breath. Breathe it in. The cold, the noise, the knowing glances. Because the show is just beginning. And next we're going behind the scenes. Before the rope tightens, before the axe glints in the morning sun, before your cousin Gertrude pretends she's never seen someone's head bounce like that, there's the ritual. And no, not the fancy religious kind. We're talking about the less glamorous, more chaotic, muddy boots and boiled cabbage kind of ritual. The pre-execution morning routine. You wake up knowing what day it is. It hangs in the air like mist over the graveyard. The air tastes metallic, like your mouth knows something's about to go very, very wrong. And yet, there's a strange excitement, that low-grade buzz, that sits somewhere between dread and a party. Like your gut can't quite decide if it's about to witness divine justice or vomit. You grab your cloak, assuming you own one, and trudge toward the town square. Everyone's already out, which is suspicious, because half these people can't be bothered to show up to mass, but give them a front row seat to a beheading and they're suddenly mourning people. Even the guy who usually sleeps in the pig pen is here, fully dressed and shockingly sober. You hear whispers before you even reach the square. They say he confessed last night. No. He tried to escape through the latrine, slipped on a rack. I heard he's the mayor's illegitimate son. Everyone has a version. No one knows anything. And that's the point. Pre-execution gossip is a sport. The condemned man's backstory morphs by the minute, fueled by ale, superstition, and the communal joy of not being the one with a date with the gallows. Near the well, two women argue over whether the condemned is guilty of murder or just thinking about murder too enthusiastically. Down by the tavern, someone's already taking bets. Not on guilt, mind you, but on how many swings the axe will take. Charming. And then you spot him, the gravedigger. No one ever talks to him. He's not exactly the life of the party, but he's here, shovel in hand, mud on his face, sipping something thick and unlabeled. Why? Because once the crowd cheers and the blood dries, someone's got to deal with the leftovers, and he's the mop crew. You catch a whiff of roasting meat, which is either breakfast or a particularly insensitive food vendor who knows timing is everything. Either way, the food stalls are bustling because nothing says spiritual reflection like chewing a greasy meat pie while someone loses their head 20 feet away. Nearby, a man is tuning a crude flute. Yes, someone is actually providing music, not a dirge either. Something vaguely upbeat. Why? Because this isn't a funeral. It's a civic gathering. A medieval mix between the Olympics and a TED Talk, except instead of watching a man run a mile, you're watching him lose all bodily autonomy. There's even a guy juggling knives. Not for symbolism, just juggling. You wonder if he realizes how on the nose that is. Probably not. He seems like the kind of guy who eats soup with a fork, and if you think all of this sounds disrespectful, the laughter, the music, the warm ale and gambling, you'd be right. But also, not really, because this is normal. This is how a society that routinely watches people die processes it without completely unraveling. They've made a holiday out of horror. Think of it as emotional insulation. Every joke, every pint of questionable cider, every whispered theory about the condemned's crimes. It's a buffer, a shield, because deep down you know what's coming, and you need something to hold on to when it happens. Children are playing, not far from the scaffold. A group of them chase each other around with sticks, pretending to execute each other in a game that would probably get you expelled from preschool today. One of them wears a sack on his head and plays the executioner. Another cries dramatically on cue. Future stars, all of them. A few mothers look over, half smiling, half wincing. You get the sense they're not entirely okay with this. But also, what else are you going to do with a child who has no toys, no books, and a deeply morbid understanding of justice? As the hour creeps closer, the mood shifts. Not dramatically, but enough. The jokes slow down. The juggler finishes his routine and packs up. People turn more often toward the scaffold, checking to see if the guards have arrived. You start to hear the term final prayers in more conversations, usually followed by a snort or a shrug. Someone nearby mutters, "Heard he bit a priest." Another adds, "That priest had it coming." No one knows anything, but the story now includes dental assault. That's how rumors age in the medieval morning sun, like milk in a sweaty boot. And then comes the sound everyone waits for, chains. The low, metallic rattle of guilt on parade. It comes from somewhere behind the chapel, slow and steady. The crowd grows still, like birds sensing an earthquake. Your neighbor stops mid-chew. The gravedigger tightens his grip on the shovel. But you do what everyone does. You turn, you watch, and you break. Because now the ritual shifts. It's no longer about gossip or pies. It's about bearing witness, about transforming from villager to voyeur, about pretending your own neck doesn't itch with imagined rope. The guards will be here soon. The condemned will follow. The jokes will stop. And then for a moment, the town square will become something sacred, awful, and eerily quiet. So take one last bite, sip your ale, whisper your theory about the condemned's alleged affair with the bishop's niece, because soon the show begins. And it's one hell of a final act. Let's take a moment to reflect on something important. What exactly did this poor soul do to deserve becoming today's featured entertainment? Steal a sheep? Whisper something impolite about the king's favourite mistress? Or, heaven forbid, act a little too Italian? Because in medieval Europe, you didn't exactly need to commit high treason to get your neck measured. No, the bar for state-sanctioned death was impressively low, offensively low. Stub your toe on the bottom rung low. Picture a legal system where punishment wasn't calibrated by the severity of your crime, but by how much of a statement the authorities wanted to make. Justice wasn't blind, she was half drunk, easily startled, and suspiciously into public humiliation. Let's start small. Theft. Steal an apple. That's a flogging. Steal a loaf of bread. We're getting warmer. Steal again. Now we're cooking with fire, and you just might end up over it. Repeat offenders weren't seen as troubled or hungry. They were seen as uncorrectable, dangerous, the kind of person whose existence was contagious, and nothing cured moral contagion like a very public, very painful, extremely irreversible demonstration. Of course, some crimes were more symbolic, like heresy, basically thinking too hard during church. Heretics didn't always steal or kill. Sometimes they just questioned things, which, in a society built entirely on unquestioned things, was the equivalent of throwing a torch into a barn full of goats and theology. Say the wrong thing about the Virgin Mary. Say nothing at all when someone else says the wrong thing. Congratulations, you've entered the heretic danger zone. And if the Inquisition gets involved, let's just say you'll be wishing for a nice boring hanging. Then we have treason, the royal favourite. But here's the kicker. Treason wasn't always about attempting to overthrow the king. Sometimes, it was thinking about overthrowing the king, or failing to stand when the king's name was mentioned, or owning a weird-looking goat that someone decided was giving the king side-eye. What counts as treason, you ask? That depends. Are you rich, noble, well-connected? Then you might get a trial, a banishment, maybe even a quiet poisoning if you're really fancy. But if you're poor, illiterate, smell vaguely unpatriotic, say hello to the scaffold. And we haven't even touched on the creative crimes. The ones so weirdly specific you know they were invented by someone who had just personally experienced them. Like the 14th century English law against harbouring Welshmen. Yep, you could be executed for letting someone too Welsh spend the night on your floor. Or how about the French edict banning the act of placing foul substances near places of noble assembly? That's right, misplace your manure, and it's curtains for you. And then there were the moral crimes. The catch-all category that made sure everyone stayed on edge. Adultery, death. Blasphemy, death. Sorcery, death with bonus flair. Being left-handed, talking to cats, or giving birth to twins during a full moon. Well, let's just say you better start digging your own grave. But the real kicker is this. None of it was consistent. One village might execute a man for stealing a chicken. The next village over, same crime, different guy, he's forced to wear chicken feathers and apologize in song. Why? Because medieval justice wasn't governed by logic or fairness. It was governed by mood, myth, and the personal whims of whoever happened to be in charge that week. And speaking of mood, let's not forget about public opinion. Sometimes, the law didn't matter at all. If the townspeople decided someone looked guilty, that was enough. Maybe they were too quiet, or their nose was the wrong shape, or they always seemed to be around when someone's goat disappeared. The mob didn't need evidence. Just a good story, and the willingness to carry torches. Which brings us to an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, people were executed not because of what they did, but because of who they were. Women, especially, walked a perilous line. Accused of witchcraft? That could be anything from healing a neighbour's rash, to owning too many spoons. Midwives were especially vulnerable. Help too many babies into the world, and suddenly people start whispering that maybe you're in league with Satan. After all, how else could a woman know where babies come from? Foreigners, too, were fair game. Speak a different dialect? Eat something weird? Practice a religion that makes the local priest nervous? Your odds of surviving a bad harvest season just dropped dramatically. And if you're wondering, weren't there trials? Sure, sometimes. Kind of. But let's not confuse trial with anything resembling due process. In many medieval courts, the goal wasn't to uncover the truth. It was to confirm suspicion. You were guilty until proven. Nope, scratch that. You were just guilty. Trials often involved ordeals, which is a lovely euphemism for torture, but with holy branding. Like holding a red-hot iron, or being dunked in a river. If you burned, you were guilty. If you floated, you were guilty. And probably a witch. And if you died, well, at least you wouldn't do it again. Let that sink in. You could literally be executed for sinking too fast. So when you stand in the town square, eyes fixed on the poor soul about to have his sins corrected via noose, ask yourself, what did he actually do? Because the answer might be, nothing much at all. He might have cursed when his cart broke, or asked a priest the wrong question, or looked at the bailiff's daughter for 1 second too long. And now he's here. While you, who definitely stole that chicken 3 weeks ago, are safe in the crowd, chewing on barley bread, pretending this is justice. Because in this world, justice isn't blind. She just looks the other way when you clap loudly enough. He stands at the edge of the scaffold, arms folded, leather apron darkened by years of unspeakable stains. His face, hidden, hooded, because of course it is. That's what you do when your job involves making people die loudly and publicly before lunchtime. You embrace the mystique. This is the executioner. the most feared, misunderstood, and paradoxically essential man in town. You don't talk to him. You don't make eye contact. You pretend he's not there until the very moment you need him to be. Kind of like death itself, but with more tools and slightly worse breath. In theory, he's a servant of justice, a neutral hand. In practice, he's a pariah with a blade, a man paid in coin, meat, and the lingering guilt of 100 screaming memories. His life is an uncomfortable riddle. Everyone needs him, but no one wants to stand next to him. He's necessary but never welcome. If he sits beside you at the tavern, you find a reason to leave. If he buys bread at the market, the vendor drops it into his sack without touching his hand, because even the coins he uses are rumored to carry a curse. So, who becomes an executioner? Well, sometimes it runs in the family, father to son, blade to blade, like some deeply unsettling heirloom. Imagine being 10 years old and learning that your inheritance isn't land or livestock, but the right to legally decapitate your neighbors. Congrats, kid. You're destined. Others were criminals given a choice. Hang or hang others. Most chose the latter. Survival first, dignity never. And then there were the occasional volunteers. Desperate, hungry men who saw in the scaffold a strange kind of security, a guaranteed wage, a roof, a place in society however cursed. The job came with perks. Free lodging, sometimes. Exemption from certain taxes. The occasional goose, and a reputation so terrifying you could walk home at midnight and not worry about bandits. Because who's going to rob the guy who beheaded their cousin? But the price was steep. Executioners weren't allowed to attend church, couldn't marry without special permission, were barred from most guilds, clubs, and casual human contact. Children crossed the street when they saw them. Dogs barked at their door. People whispered that their blood ran cold, that their shadow brought sickness. And yet, they kept showing up. Because someone had to do it. Someone had to swing the axe, tie the rope, light the fire, and as horrifying as the job was, society needed it to happen with at least some degree of professionalism. You wanted someone who could get it over with fast, who didn't miss, who didn't make a mess. Because botched executions were more than tragic. They were bad for morale, and nothing kills a good public, hanging like a slippery grip, and a crowd full of traumatized children. Many executioners were deeply trained, not just in the swing and hope for the best sense, but in human anatomy. They studied joints, arteries, spinal structures. Some even wrote manuals, because yes, there were manuals. Franz Schmidt, the infamous 16th century executioner of Nuremberg, kept a detailed diary of his work. Over 300 executions, hundreds of floggings, mutilations, brandings, and between these gruesome entries, notes about gardening, recipes, complaints about the weather, because even the hangman had a favourite stew. The contradiction is almost poetic. A man known for ending lives meticulously recorded them, as if writing it down could somehow make it all less monstrous, as if the ink could cleanse the blood. And here's something stranger. Many executioners were also healers. No, really, people would come to them with wounds, tumours, growths, or bad humours, and the executioner would offer salves, poultices, crude surgeries, because who better to stitch flesh than the man who spends his mornings slicing it open? In some towns he was both surgeon and slayer, midwife and mutilator. He could pull your tooth or remove your limb or your head. One-stop shop. And still, no one looked him in the eye. His social life? Sparse. Friends? Few. And almost always other outcasts. Gravediggers, lepers, men who cleaned the latrines. Maybe a black cat or two. Not because they liked him, just because they didn't know any better. But at home, behind thick doors where the whispers couldn't reach. Maybe he was just a man. Maybe he tended a garden. Maybe he had a child who didn't know what father did at work. Maybe he played the lute, badly. Maybe he cried. Because here's the haunting truth. Executioners were human, which means they felt things. Not always, not easily, but undeniably. And while some grew numb, hardened by repetition, soothed by wine, others never adjusted. There are stories of executioners who vomited after their work, who begged forgiveness in churches they weren't allowed to enter, who drank themselves into oblivion after every job, who had nightmares not just of screams, but of the silence that came after. And, if you're wondering, Yes, some executioners refused to continue, laid down the axe, walked away, often to be hunted or imprisoned, because quitting wasn't an option. Society could tolerate a monster, but not a disobedient one. So when you see him standing there, arms crossed, face hidden, know that behind the leather and the legend is a man who has seen the worst of humanity and helped enforce it. And when he steps forward to do his work, when the crowd gasps and the condemned begs, remember this: he is not the villain. He is the system's necessary sin, the blade sharpened by silence, the price paid to keep the illusion of order intact. And tomorrow, he'll do it all again. Alone. You hear them before you see them. Boots on stone. Chain on chain. The low, dragging rhythm of a man who knows he's on his final walk. Not to freedom, not to redemption, but to the gallows. The medieval equivalent of being escorted down the hallway with everyone whispering, "Well, that's that then. The condemned is coming." His name doesn't matter, not to the crowd. To them, he's not a man anymore. He's a warning with a face. A lesson that bleeds. But for the sake of storytelling, let's give him one. Let's call him Johann the Unlucky. A cooper by trade. A poor one, apparently, with a gambling problem, and a mouth that couldn't resist calling a magistrate's daughter sturdy. Now he's here, wrists bound in front, face swollen from last night's confession session, also known as several hours of being asked the same question while someone enthusiastically introduces your ribs to various wooden implements. 2 guards flank him, grim, unblinking, emotionally somewhere between paid, hourly, and this again. One of them occasionally jabs Johann forward with the butt of a spear, not because it's necessary, but because small cruelty is its own kind of authority. The crowd parts like water, not for respect, but for proximity. They want a better look. Want to see the limp, the bruises, the cracks in his resolve. Want to stare into the face of someone who won't be around to haunt their dreams because they'll be too busy haunting the scaffold. And Johann knows this. He hears every gasp, every whisper, every child asking, "Is that the bad man?" Followed by the parents' hasty, "Don't point, you'll anger the spirits." He feels every eye crawl across his skin, and with every step, the square grows closer, larger, louder, until he can see it. The platform, the noose, the priest. This is not a walk, it's a performance. And Johann? He's the reluctant lead actor. The walk is his entrance. The gallows is the stage. The priest? Stage manager. The executioner? Director. The crowd? Unpaid extras with very strong opinions. Every step is calibrated for maximum impact. Some towns made the condemned walk miles, through streets, through alleys, past familiar houses, and judgmental livestock. If you were lucky, it was a short stroll from dungeon to death. If not, it was a parade of shame, a literal march through everything you'd lose. Sometimes they let the condemned wear shoes, sometimes not, depending on how much suffering they wanted to showcase. Naked feet on sharp cobblestones tell a very different story than boots and dignity. And you, in the crowd, you watch. You try not to make eye contact, but you do, just for a second. And Johann looks back, and in that flicker of recognition, you feel something squirm in your chest. Because he's not monstrous. He's not even angry. He just looks tired, like someone who stayed up all night with a truth no one wanted to hear. The priest begins murmuring Latin, softly, constantly, like a theological mosquito. He's here to save Johann's soul in the 90 seconds before it leaves his body. It's all very efficient. Sometimes the condemned repeats the words. Sometimes they refuse. Sometimes they apologize. Sometimes they curse. But most often, they stay silent. Because what's left to say when you're surrounded by people who came to watch you stop being a person? The crowd doesn't want humanity. They want closure. They want catharsis. They want something to explain why their taxes are high, and their goats are missing, and their roofs leak even though they pray every Sunday. So they put it all on Johann. Let that sink in. The weight of a village's resentment, fear, guilt, all dumped onto one man, because he made the fatal mistake of being available. He reaches the scaffold, takes the first step, hesitates. The crowd holds its breath. Some cheer, some jeer. A few cross themselves, and a few, just a few, quietly turn away. Because sometimes, When you see the condemned that close, you realize how much he looks like your brother, or your neighbor, or you, with worse luck, and a louder mouth. The executioner steps forward, wordless, efficient. He grabs the rope, adjusts the height. You get the feeling he's done this before. Like a Johann is positioned, hair pushed back, collar adjusted. Because presentation matters. A well-tied noose says this death is sanctioned, practiced, part of a greater system. And Johann, he doesn't fight. That part's over. There's no dramatic thrashing, no desperate pleas. Just a long exhale that could mean anything. Fear, resignation, boredom, a moment of stillness. And then he speaks. Not loudly, not confidently, just a few words. Tell my wife, I didn't lose the coin toss. The crowd stares. You don't know what it means. Neither does the priest. But the executioner shrugs. He's heard stranger. The trapdoor creaks. The platform groans. This is the moment. The edge of everything. The breath before the fall. And you, in the crowd, feel your heart pound. Not out of compassion, because that's what this whole walk was about. Building the tension, stretching the silence, making the death mean something. Because if it doesn't, then what the hell are you doing here? Let's say, just for fun, that Johann the Unlucky hadn't been sentenced to hang. Let's say the local magistrate woke up especially theatrical that morning, stirred his porridge and said, "You know what, rope is too polite. Let's spice it up. Welcome to medieval murder bingo, where the only consistent rule is, it's going to be terrible, and you're going to watch." You might assume that executions back then were quick and clean. A swing of the axe, a twitch, and done. No muss, no fuss. Oh, sweet summer child. You forget medieval justice was never about efficiency. It was about sending a message, preferably one so loud, so grotesque, so permanently scarring, that no one would even think about jaywalking again. Let's start with the classics. Hanging. The go-to for small-time criminals and large-time theatre. You've seen it, a wooden scaffold, a rope, a drop. But here's the thing. Early hanging didn't always include that helpful drop. No neat neck snapping, just slow strangulation, feet twitching, face purple, bladder quitting the job early. It could take minutes. Or, if the gods were feeling cruel, a quarter of an hour. Ever watched a man try to scream with his throat collapsing? They did. Off. Then there's beheading. The VIP package. Reserved for nobles, clergy, or anyone with political scandal potential. It was considered merciful, a single stroke, quick and honourable. In theory, in practice, it depended on the axe and the guy holding it. There are accounts of people needing multiple strikes. Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn, got lucky. She was executed by a French swordsman, specially brought in for the job. But others? Not so fortunate. An inexperienced executioner could turn a beheading into a horrific public game of find the spine. Heads were sometimes only mostly detached, leaving the victim somewhere between executed and horrifying medical case study. And if you're imagining the crowd looking away in horror, think again. They leaned in, gasped, whispered critiques. Did they bring enough sand to soak up the blood? Would the jaw twitch? Would the eyes blink? Spoiler, sometimes. Yes, the human nervous system has zero chill. Next square on the bingo card, burning at the stake. A favourite for heretics and witches, because nothing says spiritual cleansing like roasting someone alive in a public plaza. The condemned would be tied to a wooden post surrounded by bundles of dry faggots. Not too dry, mind you, too quick. No, the point was to burn slowly. Let the smoke suffocate before the flames cooked. Some died from inhalation before the fire touched them. Others didn't. Their skin blistered, bubbled, blackened while the crowd watched, praying, gossiping, maybe buying candied almonds from a nearby vendor. You know, multitasking. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, let's talk boiling. Yes, boiling. As in, drop a person into a cauldron of bubbling liquid, water, oil, wine, sometimes lead, if they were feeling particularly spicy, and slowly simmer. Why? Usually for poisoners. The idea was poetic. If you poisoned someone quietly, you'd die loudly and long. Boiling could take over an hour. The crowd would gather, watch the skin peel, hear the screams echo through the alleyways, and think, ah yes, the law, working beautifully. But we're not done. Breaking on the wheel. Perhaps the most creatively awful. A large wooden wheel. A person tied to it. Spread eagle. Then, a large iron bar, brought down to systematically shatter the limbs, femurs, shins, forearms, with mathematically precise malice. Some victims were woven through the spokes and left to die slowly, birds picking at them like an all-you-can-eat buffet of suffering. This method wasn't just execution, it was decoration. Sometimes the body was left up for days, weeks, a grim roadside billboard that read, "Don't even think about it." Then there's the saw. Suspended upside down, legs apart. And, yes, that area first. No further elaboration needed. But just imagine standing next to your cousin at 9 a.m, watching that unfold, all while chewing on a barley bun. And of course, the rat method. A metal bucket placed over your abdomen, a hungry rat inside. Heat applied to the bucket's base. The rat, desperate to escape, starts digging downward, into you. Somewhere, some inventive lunatic came up with this, and said, yes, this is justice. Midway through this list you might wonder, what kind of society invents this many flavors of agony? Answer: one that wanted obedience, not redemption. These weren't punishments, these were sermons. Public declarations that said, see, this is what happens when you challenge the order of things. You didn't just suffer, you performed your suffering. You were the instrument through which the state played its loudest notes. And the audience, they clapped, or cried, or threw tomatoes depending on how satisfying the death was. Let that sink in. We talk about medieval executions like relics, curiosities of a more brutal time. But are we really so different? We binge documentaries about serial killers. We click videos labeled "criminal destroyed in court." We retweet court meltdowns with popcorn emojis. Maybe we swapped the scaffold for a scream, but the craving, still there. So ask yourself, when you slow down to watch a car crash, are you worried or entertained? Because the medieval crowd wasn't just a monster. They were human. Like us. You look down, there's a child next to you. Probably 8, dirty hands, cracked lips, gnawing on a turnip like it's a drumstick. His eyes are locked on the scaffold. He's not flinching. He's not crying. He's just watching. Welcome to the medieval parenting strategy. Expose your child to extreme public violence and hope it teaches them not to steal goats. Children weren't just passive background noise at executions. They were brought deliberately by parents, by priests, by the state. Because nothing says character development like watching a stranger scream for their mother while being set on fire in front of a cart full of onions. There was no babysitter, no parental guidance suggested. No one leaned in and whispered, "Maybe this part's not for you, sweetheart." In fact, the entire town square was a live-action morality tale, the kind you don't outgrow, even if your nightmares do. The logic was simple. Fear works. Kids are malleable. Mold them early. Scare them straight. And, oh, did they try? Some children were hoisted onto shoulders for a better view. Others perched on barrels, peeking through fingers, torn between curiosity and sheer terror. Some clutched dolls, or carved toys, holding tightly as if their tiny wooden knight could somehow duel death and win. And some, let's be honest, were having a blast. Because children don't fully understand death. Not the way adults do. And when everyone around you is laughing, cheering, or selling pastries, you begin to think, well, this must be normal. You start to file the image of a twitching body into the same drawer as market days and maypole dances. But it sticks. You grow up remembering the way the rope creaked, the way the crowd leaned forward as the blade came down, the way your mother whispered, "This is what happens when you disobey." Trauma dressed as lesson. Let's not pretend every child was unfazed. There are records, diaries, sermons, even court testimonies, describing children fainting, vomiting, wetting themselves, screaming long after the crowd had gone home. One chronicler from 15th century France wrote of a boy who lost the ability to speak for 3 days after witnessing a hanging. He eventually recovered, sort of. Because trauma in children doesn't always look like crying. Sometimes it looks like silence, or play. In one unsettling case from rural England, a group of children were caught reenacting a burning, using a dead pig, some stolen straw, and far too much realism. When asked where they learned it, they pointed to the village square, last Thursday's entertainment. It was education by osmosis. And it wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. Clergy praised the moral value of public executions, claiming that a child who watched a thief die would think twice before lifting bread. And if the child had nightmares, well, that just meant the lesson worked. Let that sink in. Night terrors were seen as proof of effective parenting. Of course, not every adult believed in this method. Some mothers shielded their children's eyes, some fathers turned their backs. There were even whispers, soft and rare, that maybe it wasn't healthy to raise a generation on screams and smoke. But those voices were drowned out, because nothing silences doubt like tradition, fear, and the collective agreement that this is how it's always been. And besides, the execution was a family event. A chance to bond, bake together, walk together, watch someone die together. Quality time, medieval edition. Younger children often didn't grasp the finality. They saw the executioner swing, the crowd cheer, and then the body disappear. The memory stuck, but the meaning wobbled. Some believed the condemned came back the next day. Others thought it was a game, a trick, like theatre, but with more blood. And by the time they understood, it was too late. The images were already there, woven into their mental furniture, set behind the eyes like a permanent fresco of fear. So what happens to a child who grows up watching this? Some become numb, desensitized. Death becomes casual, a thing that happens in public, loudly, to people who deserve it. Those children grow into adults who cheer harder, joke faster, throw stones before the rope is even tied. Others become fearful, submissive, haunted. They grow into the kind of adults who whisper, who hide, who obey without thinking, not because they agree, but because they remember what happens when you don't. And a few, a precious few, they grow skeptical. They remember what they saw, and somewhere along the way they begin to ask, why did everyone clap? These are the ones who write the diaries. The quiet rebels. The ones who say, maybe there's another way to teach children right from wrong that doesn't involve a man being pulled apart by horses. They were rare, but they existed. And their words, buried in old manuscripts and faded parchment and scribbled sermons, remind us that not everyone was okay with it. That even in a world built on spectacle, some children saw the horror and didn't accept it. So now you stand in the square, the execution over, the crowd dispersing, and you look again at that boy with the turnip. He's still staring at the scaffold, not blinking, not chewing, just staring. And you wonder, what did he see? What story will he tell himself tonight, as he lies in bed, listening to rats in the rafters and the wind through the cracks in the wall? Will he remember the condemned's final words, the snap of the rope, or the way his mother clapped? If you thought execution day was strictly about punishment, penance and crowd-approved dismemberment, well, you've only been watching the stage. Turn around. Just behind you, someone's selling meat pies shaped like skulls.
Welcome to the medieval death economy, where execution day wasn't just a civic duty, it was also a business opportunity.
The town square is buzzing, not with horror, with commerce. Barrels of ale, trays of fried eels, loaves of questionably risen bread. It smells like burning fat, wet wood, and something vaguely turnip adjacent, because if people are going to gather to witness a man's last breath, they might as well shop while they're at it. Merchants line the edges of the square like vultures wearing aprons. They hawk wares loudly, competing not with each other, but with the screams of the condemned. Some even tailor their sales pitch to the event. Hot pie, warm your hands while his neck cools. Yes, really. Others offer commemorative trinkets. Little wooden nooses, miniature gallows carved with disturbing detail, or charms supposedly imbued with the moral lesson of the day. Nothing quite says repent like a novelty brooch shaped like an axe. And it's not just food and trinkets. You've got storytellers too, local performers and travelling bards, spinning heroic tales of justice, often embellished with just enough local flair to make the listeners squint at their neighbours. But let's take a turn toward the spiritual. Over near the church steps, a group of monks chant softly, hoods drawn low, fingers wrapped around rosaries. They're not just here to bless the condemned or mutter last rites. No, they're also working crowd control. In the spiritual sense, their presence lends the event a certain solemnity, even if they occasionally have to pause their chanting to swat away a pie vendor getting too close. Sometimes the monks organize prayers for the soul of the dying. Sometimes they organize morality plays. Yes, the medieval theatrical genre where good and evil are performed by actors in masks, tunics, and whatever they could scavenge from last month's pageant. These performances often happen before the execution, like a warm-up act, because nothing sets the tone for state violence like a guy in a pig costume pretending to be gluttony. Picture it, a makeshift stage, children sitting cross-legged on the ground, a man dressed as death waving a papier-mâché scythe, another actor, every man, debating whether to confess his sins or eat another pie. Spoiler, he always confesses. And then he always dies. It's subtle messaging. The audience watches. Some laugh. Some frown thoughtfully. Some just want to get back to the bloodletting. But the message is clear. This isn't just about punishment. It's about moral theatre. You're not just watching a man die. You're watching your own soul get a free ethics seminar. In theory, in practice, it's a little more chaotic. A juggler drops his pins mid-sermon. A dog chases a chicken through the scene. A drunk woman yells, boring, during the devil's monologue. The monk frowns, the crowd chuckles, and the condemned, already tied to the post, probably wonders if he's being upstaged. Let that sink in. A man about to die is worried about audience engagement. Back in the marketplace, someone's haggling over dried figs. Another vendor sells wax figures of saints, guaranteed to protect your crops and possibly your conscience. Children chase each other between legs, reenacting last week's beheading with alarming accuracy. An old woman sells soup that smells suspiciously like it's had several prior lives. It's all very normal. And that's the strangest part. This is a normal day. An execution day is not a deviation from life. It is life. It's folded into the rhythms of the town. You show up, buy your bread, get a front row view of a moral cautionary tale, and head home with a handful of walnuts and a slightly more cautious approach to trespassing. Commerce thrives. Faith performs. Theatre exaggerates. And in the center of it all, literally and metaphorically, someone dies to remind everyone else not to get too clever. This wasn't a flaw in the system. This was the system, the mingling of commerce and carnage, of prayer and punishment, of morality and merch. And don't think for a second that this was unique to your quaint little hamlet. This was everywhere. In Paris, London, Florence, Prague, executions were multi-sensory events. They had soundtracks, schedules, sponsors, unofficial or otherwise. In some cities, execution days were timed to coincide with market days, not by accident, by design. Because the more people gathered, the bigger the audience. And the bigger the audience, the louder the message, and the more pies you sold. Some cities even hired vendors specifically for execution events. So it's hard to imagine the medieval hiring committee reviewing applicants like, do you have a strong stomach? Can you sell pickled eggs while a man is flayed alive? Do you have any experience with crowd heckling? In this world, pain had value, suffering had an economy, and redemption was something you could maybe, just maybe, sell by the ladle. And you, standing there, half watching, half chewing, a part of the whole machine. You've paid the baker, you've crossed yourself at the monk's chant, you've nodded meaningfully at the actor, pretending to be lust in a sackcloth tunic. You are witnessing justice, and possibly browsing discount linen. So as the executioner steps onto the scaffold, and the final act begins, just remember, you didn't come here just to see a man die. You came to shop, to pray, to be entertained, and somewhere in the middle of it all, to be reminded that the line between spectacle and sacrifice is just a few feet of rope. There's a certain rhythm to a well-executed execution. The crowd gathers, the priest mumbles, the condemned gives a final quip or sob, then the rope pulls, the blade drops, the fire crackles, and the audience nods in collective approval like they've just watched a solid theatrical matinee. But sometimes, things go wrong. Horribly, publicly, viscerally wrong. And when that happens, the entire illusion, justice, dignity, moral clarity, crumbles faster than a soggy oatcake in the rain. Take, for instance, the botched hanging. A classic misfire. It sounds simple. Tie a rope, drop a body, but medieval rope technology was more hope and friction than engineering precision. Get the knot wrong, the condemned might fall straight through the trapdoor and land in a heap, dazed but breathing. get the length wrong. Their feet might scrape the ground, turning the execution into a prolonged, awkward dangling jig of horror. The crowd hates a bad performance. In 1571, a man named John Story was condemned for treason. They hanged him, cut him down while he was still twitching, disemboweled him, and surprise, he woke up during the gutting. Spectators screamed, the executioner panicked, and John, well, he had a front row seat to his own vivisection, before mercifully blacking out for good. Let that marinate. You're supposed to die, but the state gets bored and speeds things up, forgetting to check if you're actually dead. Then there's the axe situation. In theory, beheading is quick. In theory. But the margin for error is breathtakingly small. The neck? Surprisingly sturdy. The axe? Not always sharp. The executioner? Sometimes drunk. Sometimes nervous. Sometimes new. There are stories, real ones, of executioners needing 3, 4, 7 strikes to finish the job. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was 67 years old when her executioner chased her around the scaffold, hacking at her like he was trying to open a very confused coconut. The audience didn't cheer. They winced. Some vomited. Others fainted. Because this wasn't justice. This was a public disaster. And yet, it happened more often than you'd think. Because the executioner might have been poorly trained, or too tired. Or maybe he just missed. Try explaining that to a square full of people who skipped market day to see someone die cleanly. Next on the oh god why list, fire miscalculations. You'd think burning someone at the stake would be hard to mess up. Set fire to the wood. Walk away, right? Not quite. Sometimes the wood was too wet. Sometimes the fire took too long to catch. There are accounts of condemned heretics roasting slowly, feet first, skin sloughing off in sheets, while priests debated theological points nearby. At one such event in England, a crowd watched for over 45 minutes as a man's lower body burned while his upper half thrashed and screamed. Eventually someone threw on extra oil, like that was the fix. And no, they didn't stop the execution. They just improved the fire. Then there's the accidental survival. Yes, it happened. People fell from the noose and lived. Some were buried and woke up mid-funeral. One woman in the 17th century was hanged, declared dead, carted off, only to wake up in the gravedigger's hut, with a sore neck and a very confused sense of afterlife. In some towns, this counted as divine intervention. God has spared them, cried the masses. In others, string 'em back up, muttered the magistrate, because nothing disrupts a town's moral performance like a dead man interrupting his own burial. And the crowd? Well, they didn't always take it well. A botched execution could trigger riots. You came for justice, not incompetence. People threw stones, rotten fruit, even their own shoes. A medieval insult with surprisingly good aim. One particularly gruesome execution in Prague went so sideways the executioner was chased from the city. Another had his ear sliced off as punishment for a messy job, because if you're going to murder someone publicly, you better make it look professional. Let's pause for a second. Breathe that in. The splintering wood, the confused murmurs, the realization that the state doesn't always know what it's doing. Sound familiar? Still watching? Then you know what to do. Hit that like button, unless you're too emotionally destabilized by the thought of a man catching fire from the knees up. But seriously, there's something unsettling about seeing the machine misfire. Executions are supposed to be orderly, controlled, precise. The whole point is to show that the state has things under control, that justice is deliberate, inevitable, smooth. But when the axe slips or the fire sputters or the rope snaps and the condemned sits up and coughs, the curtain pulls back, and the people, you, everyone, see the truth. This is all incredibly fragile. It's theatre dressed as order, and sometimes the script falls apart. There's something almost poetic in that. Terrifying but poetic, because these botched moments remind us that power, no matter how brutal, is still made by humans. Fallible, clumsy, sometimes drunk. So the next time someone tells you medieval justice was swift and certain, remind them that there were days when a man survived his own hanging, crawled away gasping, and made the crowd ask, "Is this what justice looks like?" And if the answer was no, well, they didn't say it too loudly, just in case someone was still holding a rope. Crowds are fickle things. One minute they're humming with anticipation, munching meat pies and gossiping about sin. The next, they're throwing rocks, spitting bile, and collectively deciding that they, not the executioner, are now in charge of the Justice Department. Because when a crowd turns ugly at a medieval execution, it doesn't just turn, it erupts. You might assume medieval folks were passive, submissive, quietly obedient to authority, as if they spent their lives doffing caps and saying, "I, me lord," before shuffling off to die of rickets. But no, give them a botched execution, an unpopular sentence, or the vague scent of injustice, and suddenly you've got a mob with pitchfork energy and no exit strategy. Picture it. The scaffold creaks. The condemned stumbles. Maybe he's well liked. Maybe the crowd believes he's innocent. Or maybe, and this is far more dangerous, maybe he dies badly, not swiftly, not cleanly, just badly. A horror show of gasps, gurgles and gore. And the crowd, which came for moral clarity and a satisfying public display of power, doesn't get what it paid for. So they snap. At first it's whispers. That was wrong. He didn't even confess. Did you see how the executioner missed? Then louder. He suffered too long. This is unjust. The rope broke. And then someone, it's always someone, throws something. A shoe, a cabbage, a broken hunk of stale bread that's been in their pouch since last market day. Doesn't matter. What matters is that it hits. And the crowd sees it. And then, like a medieval chain reaction of bad decisions, everyone joins in. Suddenly the air is thick with flying debris and moral outrage. The executioner ducks. Guards step in. People start shouting not just at the officials but at each other. You supported this. You cheered, you filthy hypocrite. That's my cousin up there. Let that sink in. It only takes one unsatisfying death for a town to start eating itself alive. There are records, actual, dusty, archival records, of full-blown gallows riots. In 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt, angry Londoners stormed the Tower, beheaded the Lord Chancellor, and paraded his head on a pike. Why? Because executions had become tools of the elite, and people noticed. A slow-burning resentment exploded into blood-soaked fury. Or consider Rouen, 4031, the burning of Joan of Arc. The execution was supposed to demonstrate religious authority. Instead, it created a martyr. Witnesses wept. Some turned away in shame, and within hours, whispers turned to muttering, turned to historical regret. Execution wasn't just a spectacle. It was a gamble. Get it right, and the crowd walks away, full of self-righteous clarity. Get it wrong. You've just handed 1,000 people a shared grievance and a front-row seat to your government's incompetence. And no one hates a messy public death quite like a medieval crowd with nothing to lose. Sometimes the fury focused on the executioner. Poor guy's just doing his job. Badly, maybe, but still. And suddenly he's dodging bottles and getting chased down an alley while villagers chant, "Off with his head." In 1605 in Würzburg, a man named Johann Reichhardt, yes, real name, professional executioner, reportedly had to flee the city after bungling a high-profile decapitation that turned into a 15-minute horror show. The crowd snapped, not just booing, storming the scaffold, flipping over carts, dragging guards into the fray. Because once the people lose faith in the performance, they start questioning the whole theatre. It wasn't always chaos. Sometimes the crowd's rebellion was eerily quiet, a refusal to clap, a mass turning of backs, a funereal silence that lingered longer than the priest's final prayer. And in that silence was danger, the kind that makes rulers tremble, because nothing terrifies power like doubt. The people weren't supposed to think. They were supposed to absorb, to believe, to internalize the message. Don't sin, or this will happen to you. But when the condemned become sympathetic, when the execution is messy, unfair, or too cruel, the message gets flipped. Wait, is this justice? Or is this just theatre in a really ugly costume? That's when cracks form. In authority, in tradition, in belief itself. Sometimes the crowd would intervene. Literally, there are stories of townsfolk rushing the scaffold, cutting the rope, pulling the condemned down like heroes in a tavern ballad. They didn't always succeed, and when they didn't, you could bet their names were added to next week's execution docket. But when they did, well, Let's just say the guards didn't sleep well for a while. And don't assume it was always high-minded resistance. Sometimes the crowd turned ugly just because they were bored. If an execution went too fast, too clean, too uneventful, the people felt cheated. They skipped work. They walked for miles. They wanted drama, screaming, a moment to tell their grandchildren about. If they got a quick drop and a silent prayer, that was grounds for civil complaint via thrown vegetables, because executions weren't just state punishment. They were group therapy, in the most horrifying sense, a place to release anger, grief, fear, and if the event didn't give the people what they needed, they made their own ending. Thought medieval people just accepted things quietly? Surprise. They rioted. They howled. They threw bricks and prayers with equal fervor, and when the gallows failed them, they built new ones, not for the condemned, for the ones who ordered the show. Let's drop the pretense for a moment. Public executions weren't just about crime and punishment. They weren't about community healing, moral instruction, or some medieval version of social therapy. No, those were just the decorations, the tinsel on the torture. At their core, public executions were about power, specifically the power of the state, the crown, the church, or whoever happened to be holding the bloody reins at the time. To remind everyone, we own your body, we own your fear, and we can snap your spine in front of your grandmother. Because, in the theatre of power, death isn't just a conclusion, it's a statement. Take any square in any city between 1200 and 1700. What do you see? A scaffold. Sure, a rope, maybe a priest. But what you're really looking at is a stage, and what's being performed is obedience. You don't just punish someone, you choreograph it. You set it at noon. You make sure the bells toll. You pick a day when the markets are full. You ensure the most important eyes are watching, because this isn't about the condemned, it's about the message. Let's consider Queen Mary de England, also known affectionately as Bloody Mary. During her 5-year reign, she burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake, publicly, painfully, on purpose. Why? Because every flame said, I am Catholic, I am sovereign, I am unchallengeable. Burning was never about correction. You don't reform someone with fire. It was about demonstration. You could disagree with the Queen in your heart, but the second you tried to speak it aloud, she had a torch with your name on it. And this wasn't new. From the Roman Empire onward, rulers have used death to sculpt the narrative. Crucifixion? That wasn't just execution. That was spectacle, a warning carved in flesh. The message, we will make your body a billboard if you resist us. And in the Middle Ages, that tradition didn't die. It evolved. Let's talk location. You'll notice executions often took place in symbolic spaces near cathedrals, palaces, or civic buildings. Not coincidental, that was branding. Every time someone was hanged outside the courthouse, it screamed, this is the long arm of the law, and we are not left-handed. Sometimes the condemned were marched through the city before their death, dragging chains past monuments of authority. Think of it like a medieval press tour, except instead of selling a book, you're modelling failure to comply with the crown. And then there's the use of titles. You weren't just John, you were John the thief, John the heretic, John the traitor. The title became part of the punishment. It rewrote your identity. Even if you somehow survived, your name didn't. Because in medieval politics, reputations died first, bodies came later. Now, don't get the idea that rulers were ashamed of this. Quite the opposite. They celebrated it. Monarchs would attend executions personally. Kings sat on viewing platforms. Queens peeked from behind tapestries. Nobles clinked goblets as heads rolled. It was gruesome. Yes, but also practical, like sharpening your sword on public opinion. One monarch even scheduled executions to align with royal births, as if to say, while life begins here, it ends there if you disobey me. There's a dark brilliance to it, because executions did what speeches couldn't. They bypassed reason, burrowed under logic, and planted their roots in fear. A pamphlet can be ignored. A protest can be argued. But a man screaming in flames? That sticks with you. Now consider how punishments changed based on who was watching. A petty thief might be hanged quietly in the woods, but a rebellious priest? He gets drawn and quartered in front of a cathedral. Why? Because symbolism scales with threat level. You kill quietly when you don't want attention. You kill loudly when you want to rewrite the room. Think of every execution as a billboard. Hanged at dawn, we caught him fast. Don't run. Burned at sunset, heresy dies in the light. Tortured first, we didn't just kill him, we made him useful. The more visible the execution, the more deeply it carved into the population's mind. And rulers wanted those scars. Because scarred people don't rebel, they remember. They remember what happens to bodies that defy the church, to voices that challenge the king, to hands that write the wrong pamphlet. And here's the really clever part. The system made you complicit. By watching, by cheering, by standing silently in the square, you helped legitimize the message. You were no longer just a subject, you were an amplifier. And if you didn't show up, that was suspicious. People noticed who wasn't in the crowd, who left early, who didn't clap. Sometimes those people ended up in the next performance, front and center, with a much less favorable view. So no, executions weren't justice. They were politics in motion. They were public relations campaigns with higher stakes and better attendance. They were reminders that the law didn't just protect, it commanded. That the crown didn't just sit, it hovered. And you didn't question it. Because when power strings a man up in the town square and makes you watch, the smart thing to do is nod. Even if your stomach turns, even if your hands tremble, even if the smell of scorched hair follows you home. Because next time, it might be you. And there are only so many ways to clap with shackled wrists. If you thought executions were just for locals, think again. Some people travelled for this. Yes, like pilgrims, but instead of holy relics or divine visions, they came to watch a man's intestines become his final scarf. Welcome to the charming world of death tourism, where the only souvenirs are trauma and possibly a splatter on your shoes. Because nothing screams cultural enrichment like booking a trip to see someone lose their head. It wasn't uncommon. If you lived in a small village with nothing but sheep, mold, and seasonal outbreaks of despair, and you heard that a heretic was being burned in the city square next Thursday, well, you packed a bag, you made it a weekend thing. Bring the family. Make a picnic of it. One chronicler even described families arriving with baskets of food, blankets, and disturbingly wine. You'd think public executions would kill the appetite, but apparently, blood pairs well with bread. And it wasn't just peasants. Nobles came too. Educated men, foreign visitors, diplomats, people with options. Why? Because watching someone get flayed alive was considered not just thrilling, but also informative. A live TED talk, but instead of slides, there were entrails. Let that settle for a second. People rode for days, through mud, cold, and bandit-riddled roads, not to see a wedding, or a coronation, or a saint perform a miracle, but to watch a stranger die, very badly in front of a yelling mob. In Paris, major executions near Notre Dame would draw such immense crowds that businesses closed early. Street vendors set up like it was a summer festival. Inns raised prices. Local guides, yes, guides would lead foreigners to the best spots for maximum carnage visibility. In 1535, when English monk John Houghton was executed for refusing to recognize Henry VIII's supremacy over the church, visitors from the continent came to witness the event. Why? Because nothing demonstrates royal authority quite like dragging a priest through the streets, hanging him until mostly dead, cutting him down, and pulling out his insides before a cheering crowd. God save the king. And tourists wrote about it. Letters, travel journals, even poems, some rapturous, others sickened, but nearly all of them shared one theme: this is horrifying, and I couldn't look away. One Italian visitor in the 16th century described a beheading as a lesson in consequence. Another wrote that he was disgusted to the marrow, yet found himself applauding. That's tourism with emotional whiplash. Some travellers came for religious edification. Watching a heretic burn was like a live-action morality play. Proof that sin leads to fire, and not just the metaphorical kind. Others came for entertainment. That's right, they just liked it. It was something to do, a bit of drama to break up the bleak monotony of medieval existence. Because here's the uncomfortable truth, medieval people weren't that different from us. You slow down at car crashes. You binge true crime. You listen to podcasts about murder during your lunch break. And sure, your entertainment is digital, your popcorn less bloody, but the instinct, same species. Now, not every traveller was delighted. Some arrived full of excitement, only to crumble at the first scream. One noble woman fainted during a particularly gruesome quartering in France, hitting her head on the stone plaza. She recovered, probably, but didn't write about her travels after that. And yet, the crowds kept coming, even for repeated events. In cities with regular executions, some tourists became fans. Oh, you must see an English hanging much more poetic than the Germans. Or Spanish garrotings have a certain flair. It became a thing. A twisted form of cultural comparison. There were even execution hotspots. Cities with reputations. Paris, Rome, London, Prague. Places where justice was loud, brutal, and well staged. The reputation alone drew visitors, eager to check state-sanctioned death off their medieval bucket list. It's unsettling. But it also makes perfect sense, because executions weren't just about punishment. They were about spectacle, carefully designed, widely advertised, and perfectly suited for travellers with a stomach for horror and a thirst for meaning. And the governments? They loved it. A big crowd meant the message spread further. Outsiders carried the tale home. I saw a man flayed alive for forging coins, they'd say, sipping wine in someone else's village. And they cheered. That's state propaganda with international reach. It was free PR, terrifying, unforgettable, blood-slick PR. And yes, you could buy things. Commemorative pamphlets, wooden effigies, prayers, supposedly blessed by a dying priest, still warm. If you were lucky, you might even snag a piece of the rope or stake. Relics, conversation starters. Oh, it's from the burning of that blasphemer in Rouen. Great trip. But what did people feel when they returned home? Some were thrilled, bragged, added it to the tapestry of their worldly experiences. I've seen Rome, Florence, and a man's head roll down cobblestones like a dropped melon. Others were shaken, haunted, unable to sleep for weeks, but they still told the story, because witnessing something that real, that raw, it gives you a kind of second-hand authority. I was there, you say. I saw what happens when people defy the law. So here's the real takeaway. Public executions weren't just local theatre. They were exportable trauma, a national brand, a performance designed to stick in your mind, travel in your words, and echo in places far from the scaffold. And if that doesn't sound familiar, think again. You've watched courtroom meltdowns go viral. You've seen trial footage dissected by strangers for likes and ad revenue. You've probably clicked play on something awful, felt sick, and then forwarded it to a friend with a one-line caption. Watch this. Modern execution. Same show, just better light. So, the crowd gasped. The head fell. The priest crossed himself. The executioner wiped his blade. Curtains down, right? Not quite. Because in the grand production of medieval justice, the death was only Act 2. The final chapter, that came after the blood stopped flowing and the screams faded into uncomfortable silence. That's when the body, that poor, unceremonious pile of meat, had to be dealt with. And spoiler alert, there was no dignity in death clause. Let's start with the basics. Once the show was over, the corpse was technically property of the state, which means you, the grieving family, the horrified sibling, the regretful mob member, didn't get to waltz up and claim Aunt Marjorie's remains, not unless you had serious money, political leverage, or divine intervention. And even then the chances were slim. What usually happened? Well, it depended on the crime, the location, and how dramatic the message needed to be. But let's just say the average condemned body didn't get a casket and a hymnal. It got a wheelbarrow and a pit. Sometimes not even that. Some were dumped in mass graves, also known as execution pits. Shallow, hurried, and often reused. One on top of another, just long enough for the maggots to do their part, and for the smell to teach nearby children an unforgettable biology lesson. But let's say the crime was especially egregious. Treason, heresy, or just a monarch in a bad mood. Then, the corpse might get repurposed. Heads went on spikes, limbs were nailed to city gates, bodies were hung from gibbets, those creepy metal cages where the dead swayed in the wind, rattling like old armor. It wasn't about punishment anymore, it was about reminders. See that arm? That's what stealing gets you. Enjoy your market day. One 15th century account, describes a thief whose body was boiled, his skin flayed, and his remains displayed along the main road for weeks. Travellers threw up, horses reared, children wept. Mission accomplished. And here's where it gets even worse. Yes, worse. Some bodies weren't left to rot. They were given to science, or at least what passed for science at the time. In certain universities, think Bologna, Padua, or even early Oxford, condemned criminals were dissected in public lecture halls, and by dissected we mean hacked apart on a wooden slab, while students took notes and probably snacked. Because yes, anatomy class was often bio bread and wine. You might ask, was that at least done respectfully? Well, no. Imagine your dead uncle being pointed at by a bald man in a robe as he explains liver function to a bunch of 19-year-olds with no gloves. Now imagine that uncle was just executed for heresy, and his head is currently in a bucket. Now we're getting warmer. Sometimes parts were kept, preserved, displayed in glass jars. This here's the lung of a pickpocket, smoked for preservation. In some cases, physicians even wrote poetry about the body they dissected, because nothing says emotional health like romanticizing a spleen. And while all that was happening in the intellectual circles, outside, crows were feasting. Yes, actual crows. Birds with taste for viscera, and no concept of human shame. They became regulars at hanging sites and gibbets, often pulling out eyes before the executioner had even packed up his tools. One observer wrote, "The birds do the devil's work quickly." Charming. There were also rituals, not out of respect, out of superstition. Some people believed that pieces of an executed criminal's body carried magical or medicinal properties. That's right, you could grind down a piece of bone and use it as a cure for headaches, seizures, infertility, and yes, people paid for this. You thought MLM schemes were bad now? Try selling powdered murderer in burlap pouches. Meanwhile, back at the gibbet, kids dared each other to touch the foot of a corpse. Lovers carved initials into the scaffold post. Stray dogs dragged off unguarded arms. It was morbid, gross, and stunningly normal. Now, in rare cases, the body was returned to the family, usually after heavy begging or bribery, and even then, conditions applied. No funeral processions, no religious rites. Bury them in secret, preferably somewhere damp and unmarked. It wasn't a homecoming, it was tactical disposal. And for the families that never got the body, they mourned a ghost, a stain on the family name, a chair that stayed empty at meals. And let's not forget, if you were related to someone executed for treason or heresy, you became suspect. Surveillance by association, generational guilt, not the inheritance anyone wants. Which brings us back to the square. It's been hours since the crowd dispersed. The scaffold creaks in the breeze. Blood has dried into the wood, and the only sounds are wind and the soft peck of beaks. The show's over, but the aftermath has only begun. And for the poor soul who died that morning, their fate is just getting started, as medicine, as a warning, as bird food, as superstition, or as nothing at all, just dust and silence. And maybe, if they're lucky, a whispered prayer by a passerby who remembers their name. Eventually the blood dries. The scaffold creaks empty. The crows flap off, full and satisfied. And you, yes, you medieval execution attendee, you go home. But the show doesn't leave with you, because now it's in your dreams. Let's talk about something the history books skim past. The witnesses. The ones who didn't die, didn't kill, didn't swing the axe, but stood close enough to hear the tendons snap. The ones who couldn't wash off the smell, no matter how many buckets of water they threw at their clothes. The ones who didn't forget, because not everyone laughed, not everyone clapped, not everyone found it a bit of good sport. For some, the images stayed long after the crowd vanished. Picture it, a monk in Flanders, 3042, writing in his diary about a woman burned alive for heresy. He doesn't describe the crime. He barely describes the law, but he does describe the moment she stopped screaming, and how he didn't sleep for days. Or the 16th century mother who brought her son to a hanging so that he may learn righteousness, only for him to vomit halfway through and burst into inconsolable sobs. For years after he refused to enter the town square, even as an adult, he wept at the toll of the execution bell. His journals are still tucked away in a provincial archive, stained with tears and ink. Trauma isn't new. PTSD didn't appear with the invention of the modern battlefield. It just didn't have a name. In medieval times, they called it melancholia, or possession, or simply a curse. But we can read between the lines. The shaking hands, the refusal to speak, the sudden screaming in the night. There was the man who fainted during a beheading, and when revived refused to speak for the rest of the day. Just sat, eyes wide, hands clenched. His wife reported he would later rock back and forth, muttering, the twitch, referring, presumably, to the way the condemned's limbs flailed when the axe hit wrong. Let that image take its time. Some never returned to the site again. Not even for festivals, markets or sermons. They avoided the scaffold like it held a spell. Others returned obsessively, as if looking for meaning, as if trying to make peace with something they couldn't name. And let's not forget, sometimes you were the reason they were up there, because medieval justice was communal. Trials were public. Accusations often came from neighbors. Maybe you testified. Maybe you cheered. Maybe you whispered something about that woman down the lane who danced too much during Lent, and then watched her burn. What do you do with that? You can try to justify it. She was guilty. It was the law. It wasn't personal. But memory doesn't always listen to reason. Sometimes, it just shows you the flames, the screaming, the moment she locked eyes with you, and that's when the guilt settles in. There's a surviving letter from a 15th century tailor who wrote of witnessing a man broken on the wheel. The condemned had once mended his boots. A simple thing. But as the bones cracked, the tailor said he could still hear the man humming, just as he had when stitching leather. That sound haunted him, followed him into sleep, into meals, into prayer. He stopped going to church after that, told people he heard the humming in the hymns. Some monks and nuns wrote of spiritual crises after executions. One nun in particular, Sister Elodia 4071, witnessed the hanging of a pregnant thief. The baby was cut from the womb post-mortem, then baptized. The nun reported visions of the child, floating, crying, hovering in doorways. She said she heard it in the wind. Creepy? Yes. Psychological? Absolutely. You might wonder, didn't people back then just accept violence as normal? Well, here's the twist. They did, until it hit them wrong, until the condemned looked like their son, or sounded like their sister, or reminded them of themselves, which happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. Because in a world where death was public, pain was instructional, and justice was theatre, the line between audience and victim was terrifyingly thin. So yes, some never forgot. Not after weeks. Not after decades. There's a story of a soldier who, as a child, watched a beheading. Later in life, while stationed in a far-off garrison, he tried to describe what he'd seen to another soldier, but he couldn't. He wept. Not cried, wept. And then fell silent. The other soldier said it was like the man had a ghost wrapped around his throat. Haunting, isn't it? And remember, there were no therapists, no hotlines, no safe spaces. You processed what you saw in silence. Or you didn't. You just kept it locked behind your eyes, and hoped it didn't poison your dreams. Now here's the hardest question. What if you clapped? What if you cheered? Threw a stone? Laughed when the rope snapped the wrong way? What if you told the story at the tavern like a joke? And then one night, years later, you woke up with sweat on your collar and a scream in your lungs. Can you forgive yourself? Because this isn't just about history. It's about being human. About how close we all skate to the edge. How easily we cheer what we don't understand, until it turns and looks back at us. So yes, the blood washed off. But the memories? They stayed, tucked in diaries, etched in church walls, echoing down through family legends. Not every execution had a happy crowd. Some had ghosts, and just like that, it's over. The crowd disperses slowly, like smoke from a dying fire. The laughter has faded, the food vendors pack up their pies. The children are suddenly very quiet, and you start to walk. No one tells you to leave. You just know it's time. The town square no longer hums with anticipation. It hums with something else now. An awkward hush, as if everyone's trying very hard not to make eye contact. The scaffold still stands behind you, splashed in fading crimson. Bits of sawdust and blood mingle underfoot, like the remnants of a very disturbing birthday party. And yet, no one rushes to clean it. It just exists, A leftover, like something you try to ignore in the corner of the room. You start heading home down the cobbled streets where even the air seems different. Heavier. Quiet isn't usually this loud, is it? A dog barks. Far off. A baby cries. Somewhere someone mutters a prayer. You pass others from the crowd. People who, just an hour ago, were elbowing each other to get a better view. Now, they walk like ghosts, heads down, steps measured. One man drags his feet like he's carrying something invisible. He is. You all are. No one talks about it. No one says, well, that was a bit much. Instead, they talk about the weather, the harvest, the king's taxes, anything except the gurgling sound a man makes when the rope doesn't break his neck properly. Anything but the fact that you all watched. And worse, some of you enjoyed it. That's the thing about public executions. The lead-up is a party. The aftermath is a funeral. There's a strange tension in your chest as you walk. Not grief, exactly. Not guilt either. Something else. Something harder to name. Like your body knows it just witnessed something unnatural. Even if your culture tells you it was justice. Was it? The man or woman who died today may have been a criminal. A thief. A heretic. A rebel. Or maybe just someone who made the wrong enemy. Whatever they were, they are now gone, and you were there for it. Front row. No refund. You try to remember their face, but all you can summon is the moment, the drop, the twist, the gasp. It's burned into your memory now, like a scar you can't see, but feel every time the wind shifts. Someone in front of you starts to hum, a low, tuneless thing. Maybe it's nervousness. Maybe it's habit, but it grates. It fills the space where the silence was trying to rest. A woman adjusts her shawl. Her hands shake. She says nothing. The child asks, "Will he wake up?" The mother doesn't answer, just pulls the child closer and walks faster. And suddenly, you realize something. No matter how many times you've seen it, it never really gets easier. Not truly. Maybe you pretend. Maybe you even laugh about it over ale later tonight. But there's a part of you that will stay frozen in that square, watching the body fall, wondering what kind of world turns death into spectacle. You reach your home. Simple door, muddy threshold. The smell of stew someone tried to keep warm. You close the door behind you, and the silence follows you in. No bells now, no shouts, just the dull thud of your own heartbeat. You sit, you stare at the wall. Maybe you take off your shoes. Maybe you don't. You think about the man's shoes. Were they still on his feet when he died? Why are you thinking about that? You shake your head, as if that'll dislodge the image. It doesn't. Somewhere outside, a rooster crows like it's morning again. Time has looped, or maybe it never moved forward. You poke at your food. The bread feels dry. The broth tastes like ash. You wonder how long the body will stay on the scaffold. Will someone take it down tonight? Or will it be there tomorrow, stiff and discoloured, a new landmark for passing merchants? You hope not. Or do you? 'Cause here's the darker truth. As much as you want to forget, you don't. Not fully, not ever. Some part of you needs to remember, to feel that uneasy thrum in your bones, to look at the gallows and say, "There but for the grace of God." It's a ritual, not just for justice, but for fear. You were reminded today of how thin the ice is, how sharp the blade, how fast the crowd turns from bakery queue to bloodthirsty chorus. Let that sink in. And tomorrow, life will go on. The baker will sell rolls. The children will play in the square again. The priest will give his sermon about repentance and order. And maybe, just maybe, someone will sweep the scaffold. Or maybe it will wait until the next one, because there's always a next one. Justice is a calendar. The gallows don't rust. And you'll show up again. Maybe earlier this time, to get a better spot. Maybe with your friend. Maybe with your child. You'll tell yourself it's normal. It's tradition. It's duty. But deep down, in that silent, unspoken place inside you, the one that stirred as you walked home today, you'll wonder, what does this make me? You won't say it out loud, but you'll feel it. Every time you hear the bell toll. So here we are. The square is empty, the blood is drying, and history, being the tireless little gossip that it is, moves on. But the scaffold? It never really leaves us. See, we like to think we're different. Now, more civilized. Less Medieval. After all, we don't hold executions in the town square anymore. We don't cheer when someone dies. We don't bring our kids to watch a man's body get torn apart by horses, do we? Right? Well, let's talk about that. Because while we may have swapped out the wooden gallows for courtroom cameras and the village gossip for a trending hashtag, the instinct, the human impulse, hasn't gone anywhere. We still gather, we still watch, we still point, and oh yes, we still judge. The scaffold just got a software update. Today, it's the courtroom livestream, the viral mugshot, the flaming Twitter thread, it's the comment section turned lynch mob, it's justice as content, morality, now available in 4K. We binge trials like they're prestige TV. And let's be honest, part of us loves it. The drama, the outrage, the public reckoning. It scratches some ancient itch, buried deep in the cerebellum next to throw rock at thing, and don't eat glowing mushroom, because public punishment has always been about more than justice. It's been about control, a show, a spectacle, a warning. In the medieval era, kings and queens wielded executions like a microphone, a message to the masses. Step out of line, and you too will dance the gallows jig. The crowd came for justice, but the crown came for dominance. And don't pretend we've outgrown that. Think of the modern perp walk, the media frenzy outside a courthouse, the flashing cameras, the security escorts, the headlines that scream guilty before the verdict's even in. We still love a public fall, especially when the person is rich or powerful, or, let's be real, someone we already didn't like. Mob justice may have traded torches for keyboards, but the flames feel awfully familiar. Even our language remembers. Scapegoat, witch hunt, trial by fire. These aren't metaphors, they're historical echoes. Tiny ghosts hiding in our idioms. And the internet? It's one endless town square. Every day, a new hanging, digital pitchforks. Someone trending for the worst reason imaginable. We don't even have to be there. But we click, we watch, we scroll, we participate, because part of us still craves that boundary. The line between good and evil, sinner and saint, us and them. We want to believe that if we boo loud enough, we're not them. We're better. Let that settle in your chest for a minute. This is the legacy of the gallows. But it's not all bad news, because in those same crowds, even back then, were people who questioned, who flinched when the blade fell, who went home troubled, who whispered to themselves, surely there must be another way. They were rare, but they were real, and their legacy lives on too. In the activists, the writers, the ones who ask hard questions about justice, punishment and power, the ones who say, maybe the measure of a society isn't how it punishes, but how it forgives, or how it understands, or how it doesn't turn pain into theatre. Maybe we inherit that too, because history isn't a straight line. It's a spiral. And every so often, we arrive back at the scaffold, not as executioners or victims, but as witnesses, faced with the same old questions dressed in new robes. Are we here to learn? To gawk? To condemn? Or are we finally ready to understand? There's a famous quote, often misattributed, but still haunting. Every time history repeats itself, the price goes up. And if we don't reckon with what we've inherited, the thrill of punishment, the glamour of justice as spectacle, we risk building newer, shinier scaffolds, the kind that stream in HD, the kind that don't need ropes to ruin a life. So yes, the gallows are gone, but the crowd? We're still here, standing in the square, watching, clicking, judging, and somewhere, deep in our cultural DNA, the echoes of tolling bells and cheering masses still hum beneath the surface of our so-called civility. We didn't leave the medieval world behind. We just gave it Wi-Fi. So, next time you feel that righteous anger bubbling, when the algorithm serves up another scandal, another villain, another public downfall, take a breath. Step back, ask yourself, are you seeking justice? Or just looking for a front row seat? Still awake? Congratulations, you've survived someone else's death and your own medieval moral crisis. If this dark dive through history made you laugh, cringe, or reflect a little too deeply, hit that subscribe button. Because next time, we might explore what it was like to be a medieval plague doctor's assistant. Spoiler, you'd stink.